Night fell heavy over Blackwood Plantation like a suffocating veil. The wind moved through the cypress trees the way grief moves through memory, quiet, restless, and impossible to escape. Lanterns flickered across a sprawling estate built on chains, blood, and silence. To outsiders, it was a symbol of wealth and power. But beneath its polished columns lay a far darker truth, one soaked in cruelty, terror, and rebellion. For years the master ruled with an iron hand, believing his word was law and his power untouchable. He carved his name into the land with fear, turning human beings into property and punishment into routine. Yet history has a way of turning itself. The very man he crushed beneath his boot would one day rise against him, not as property, but as judgment. This is not just a story of revenge. It is a reckoning written in shadows, whispered through generations, and buried in forbidden records. Tonight, we step into that darkness. If stories like this grip your soul, make sure you subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss a hidden chapter of history. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, your city, your country, your corner of the world. Your presence keeps these forgotten voices alive. The land that became Blackwood Plantation was not gentle when the first surveyors arrived. It was wild, waterlogged, and humming with life that refused to be tamed, a vast stretch of cypress swamps, thick forests, and dark riverbanks where fog clung to the ground like a living thing. Early settlers spoke of the soil as both curse and opportunity, fertile yet treacherous, rich enough to grow fortunes but demanding a brutal price in sweat and suffering. The river cut through the terrain like a scar, carrying driftwood, whispers of storms, and the distant cries of birds, while alligators lurked beneath its surface, watching every movement with cold patience. It was here that the plantation master's ancestors claimed the land, clearing trees with fire and iron, forcing the wilderness to bow to their ambition. They marked boundaries with crude wooden stakes, believing dominion over nature justified dominion over people, and from that belief, the plantation was born. What began as a rough settlement slowly transformed into an empire of crops, power, and control that would cast a long shadow over generations. Even in its earliest days, there was a sense that something cruel was woven into its foundation. As the years passed, wooden cabins gave way to grand structures, and a towering mansion rose at the center of the estate, built with materials carried on the backs of enslaved men and women. White columns stretched toward the sky like symbols of arrogance, gleaming in the sun while hidden hands labored endlessly behind them. Fields of cotton, sugar, and tobacco spread outward in every direction, neat rows disguising the brutality required to maintain them. Carriages rolled along dirt roads that had been carved through blood and exhaustion, bringing traders, dignitaries, and wealthy visitors who saw only prosperity, never the suffering beneath it. The plantation became a machine of profit, its economy fueled by forced labor, punishment, and silence, with every brick and beam soaked in an unspoken history. To outsiders it appeared orderly and refined, a model of southern grandeur, yet inside its gates life moved like a constant storm of fear. The estate grew larger with each harvest, swallowing neighboring lands and tightening its grip on the region. The master who inherited this domain did not arrive as a humble steward, but as a man already shaped by privilege and entitlement. Raised in comfort, he learned early that power came not from kindness, but from dominance, and that obedience could be commanded rather than earned. His family had deep ties to local politics, churches, and trading networks, allowing him to move through society with an air of untouchability. He dressed impeccably, spoke with polished authority, and carried himself like a ruler surveying his kingdom. Behind closed doors, however, his temperament was unpredictable, shifting from calculated charm to icy cruelty in moments. Servants and overseers quickly learned that pleasing him meant survival, while displeasing him meant punishment without mercy. He studied plantation records obsessively, not out of care for those who worked the land, but to ensure maximum profit and absolute control. In his mind, the estate was not merely property, but an extension of his will. Among neighboring planters, his reputation spread rapidly. Whispered in drawing rooms and spoken openly at gatherings where wealth was measured by acres and enslaved bodies. Some admired his efficiency, calling him disciplined, strategic, and formidable, while others quietly feared his lack of compassion. Stories circulated of harsh whippings carried out in the dead of night, of workers pushed beyond their limits until they collapsed in the fields. Yet no one dared challenge him publicly, for his influence reached far beyond the plantation's borders. Merchants sought his favor, politicians courted his support, and clergy overlooked his transgressions in exchange for donations. To the outside world, he appeared as a pillar of society, but beneath that polished image lay a man driven by control rather than conscience. His name became synonymous with both prosperity and dread, a dual legacy that followed him wherever he went. Within the plantation itself, a strict hierarchy governed every aspect of daily life, designed to keep those in bondage divided and powerless. Overseers patrolled the fields with whips at their sides, enforcing silence and obedience through intimidation. Inside the mansion, ledgers recorded not just crops and finances, but the value assigned to human lives, reducing men, women, and children to numbers on paper. The master took pride in these records, believing they proved his mastery over both land and people. Barns, sheds, and quarters were arranged with military precision, leaving no space for freedom or privacy. Every sunrise brought the same rhythm of forced labor, every sunset the same lingering tension in the air. The plantation functioned like a living organism powered by fear, its heartbeat echoing through every cabin and corridor. Even the architecture seemed to watch, with high windows and shadowed hallways reinforcing the feeling that no one was truly unseen. For the enslaved community, the master's reputation shaped every breath they took, creating an atmosphere of constant vigilance and quiet resistance. Mothers warned their children to keep their eyes lowered and their voices soft, while elders shared fragments of history in hushed tones after dark. Songs carried coded messages through the fields, blending sorrow with hope, and prayers were whispered as acts of defiance rather than submission. Many remembered earlier masters who had been cruel, but none like this one, whose anger felt colder and more deliberate. Still, beneath the surface, bonds of solidarity grew stronger, forged through shared hardship and silent understanding. The plantation might have belonged to the master in law, but in spirit it belonged to those who worked it, even if that truth remained hidden. Every lash, every order, and every injustice added another layer to a story that had yet to fully unfold. As Blackwood Plantation expanded, so did the master's influence, reaching into markets, courts, and councils that shaped the region's future. He invested in new machinery, hired more overseers, and acquired additional land, believing growth would cement his legacy. Visitors marveled at the estate's scale, rarely questioning the cost at which it was built. Yet beneath the surface of success, tension simmered like a storm gathering on the horizon. The more powerful he became, the more fragile his control truly was, resting on a foundation of fear rather than loyalty. The river continued to flow past the mansion, carrying whispers of rebellion in its currents, while the cypress trees stood like silent witnesses to everything unfolding. Every aspect of the plantation's rise was intertwined with suffering, ambition, and an unspoken reckoning that hovered over the land. He was not born beneath the white columns of Blackwood, but in a smaller, harsher place where the earth smelled of iron and damp rot, a hidden clearing where enslaved mothers tried to keep fragments of home alive through song and story. His earliest memories were stitched together from shadows, the flicker of firelight on rough cabin walls, and the low murmur of women praying in languages that drifted like ghosts through the night. He did not understand chains at first, only the warmth of his mother's arms and the rhythm of her breathing that lulled him to sleep despite the ever-present dread. Children around him learned to walk on dirt packed hard by countless footsteps, their laughter always cautious, as if even joy could be punished. From infancy, he sensed that the world was divided into those who commanded and those who survived, though he had no words for it. The plantation beyond the clearing felt distant then, a looming presence rather than a lived reality, yet its shadow already touched his life. Even before he could speak, he was being shaped by a system that treated his existence as expendable. When he was barely old enough to remember his own name, the first rupture tore through his life like a storm. The day traders arrived with wagons and hard eyes. Whispers traveled through the quarters long before the horses were heard, and fear spread faster than fire through dry grass. His mother held him tighter than ever, her hands trembling, knowing that family meant little in a world that sold people like livestock. The air grew thick with panic as men were inspected, women measured, and children stared in confusion at strangers who spoke only in commands. He remembered the sound of wheels grinding against the road and the bitter taste of dust in his mouth. At some point he was pulled away, not violently in that moment, but with the cold certainty of ownership transferring from one hand to another. His mother's face blurred through tears as distance stretched between them, a separation that carved itself into his memory. From that day forward, his childhood became a journey rather than a home. The transport to Blackwood was a blur of movement, noise, and disorientation, with the river running alongside the road like a dark companion. Older captives tried to comfort him in low voices, teaching him when to speak and when to stay silent, passing down survival like a fragile inheritance. He learned quickly that fear was constant but had many faces, sometimes loud and brutal, other times quiet and calculating. Nights were spent under open skies or in cramped pens where the smell of sweat and despair lingered long after dawn. He clung to small things, the texture of a wooden bead someone gave him, the melody of a song that reminded him of his mother's lullaby. By the time the Blackwood gates appeared, towering and unforgiving, he was already older than his years. Childhood had begun to fade, replaced by a sharpened awareness of danger. Inside the plantation, his first days felt like entering a living labyrinth designed to crush individuality. The mansion loomed in the distance, pristine and untouchable, while the quarters where he was housed stood cramped and worn. He was assigned to minor tasks at first, carrying water, fetching tools, and observing the grim routines of adult labor. Overseers watched every movement, their eyes scanning for defiance even where none existed. Other enslaved children taught him the unspoken rules, how to move quickly, how to avoid attention, how to disappear when necessary. He absorbed everything, storing each lesson like a stone placed in a growing wall around his heart. Yet beneath his caution lingered a quiet curiosity about the land, the river, and the distant woods that whispered of freedom he could not yet imagine. Blackwood became both his prison and his classroom. As he grew, the work intensified, and so did his understanding of the master's cruelty. He witnessed punishments meant not just to enforce obedience, but to break spirits, moments that left him shaking long after they ended. Still, he learned to mask his fear, keeping his face unreadable while his mind raced with questions about why some lives were valued and others discarded. Older workers took him under their wing, sharing fragments of history and survival strategies in hushed tones after dark. They spoke of lost families, stolen identities, and the fragile threads that connected them to their past. Through them, he began to see himself not merely as property, but as part of a lineage that refused to vanish. Every story planted a seed of resilience that would one day grow beyond the plantation's control. His first direct encounter with the master came gradually, not in a single dramatic moment, but through countless small interactions that revealed the man's nature. He was summoned to carry items into the mansion, moving through halls that felt both grand and suffocating. The master rarely looked at him directly, yet his presence filled every room like a cold draught. Commands were brief, sharp, and devoid of humanity, reducing the boy to a tool rather than a person. In those moments, the boy sensed the vast gulf between them, a chasm carved by power, wealth, and oppression. Still, he watched closely, studying the master's habits, his movements, his patterns of control. Observation became his quiet form of resistance, a way of understanding the system that sought to erase him. By the time adolescence approached, the boy was no longer simply surviving, but silently hardening. Memories of his mother remained like a distant heartbeat, reminding him that he had once belonged to someone who loved him rather than owned him. Each day at Blackwood layered more experience onto his soul, blending sorrow with an unspoken determination. He saw both the worst and best of humanity within the plantation, cruelty from those in power and compassion among those in chains. The river continued to flow past the estate, carrying echoes of his past, while hinting at a future he could not yet grasp. In that tension between memory and reality, between bondage and possibility, his identity took shape inside the shadow of Blackwood. Dawn on the plantation never felt like a beginning, but like a repeated sentence, spoken again and again in sweat, dust, and exhaustion. Before the sun fully cleared the horizon, horns cut through the dark like blades, dragging the enslaved from their fragile sleep into a world already waiting to grind them down. Men, women, and children poured out of cramped cabins, faces lined with fatigue, backs already bracing for the weight of the day ahead. Overseers moved among them like hunting dogs, boots crunching on hard ground, eyes scanning for hesitation, whisper, or weakness. Tools were placed into trembling hands, and lines formed in eerie silence, broken only by the creak of carts and the distant lowing of animals that seemed to live in better conditions than human beings. Every morning reinforced the same brutal truth. Survival meant obedience, and obedience meant surrendering any sense of self. The plantation breathed in their fear as naturally as it did the humid air. In the fields, labor stretched far beyond what any body should endure, rows of cotton and sugar bending endlessly toward the horizon. The sun pressed down like an invisible weight, burning skin, drying throats, and blurring vision until the world became a wavering haze. Hands moved automatically, picking, cutting, hauling, never stopping, never slowing, even when muscles screamed in protest. Children worked beside adults, their small bodies forced into rhythms meant for grown men and women. Overseers stalked between rows, cracking whips into the air, not always to strike, but to remind everyone of their power. Heat, mixed with the smell of sweat, soil, and blood from small cuts that went untreated. Conversations were forbidden, and even a glance between workers carried risk, turning the field into a landscape of isolated suffering. Punishment was woven into daily life rather than reserved for rare transgressions, creating a culture where fear ruled every moment. A worker who dropped a tool, stumbled from exhaustion, or fell behind could be dragged before others as an example. Whippings were carried out in full view, not only to harm the body but to fracture the spirit of everyone watching. Some were tied to posts under the scorching sun, left to burn, thirst, and tremble, while others were forced to keep working around them. Screams echoed across the fields like warnings carried on the wind, sinking into the minds of those who heard them. Yet punishment was not always loud. Sometimes it was colder, more calculated, such as isolation, food deprivation, or threats of separation from family. Cruelty became routine, stripping suffering of shock and turning it into a daily expectation. Inside the plantation quarters, oppression took quieter but equally suffocating forms, shaping every aspect of personal life. Families lived in overcrowded cabins where privacy did not exist and rest was fragile at best. Mothers tried to protect their children from the worst of the world, yet the walls themselves seemed to carry the master's presence. Food was rationed sparingly, often barely enough to sustain bodies pushed to their limits. At night, pain lingered in aching limbs, and sleep came fitfully amid whispered prayers and stifled sobs. Still, the enslaved found small ways to hold on to humanity through shared meals, stories, and songs that carried coded meanings. Even these moments of connection existed under constant threat, for discovery could lead to brutal retaliation. The quarters were both refuge and prison, a place where life persisted but never felt free. Psychological control proved just as devastating as physical punishment, designed to break not only bodies, but identities. The master and overseers worked deliberately to erase names, histories, and family ties that might inspire resistance. Enslaved people were referred to by numbers or degrading labels, reinforcing the idea that they were less than human. Movement across the plantation was tightly restricted, and any sign of independent thought was treated as rebellion. Rumors of auctions or forced relocations hung constantly in the air, keeping everyone in a state of anxious uncertainty. Children grew up learning not only how to work, but how to suppress curiosity, anger, and hope. Fear became internalized, shaping behavior even when no overseer was present. Power lived as much in minds as in whips. Religion and morality were twisted into tools of domination, preached selectively to justify the system rather than challenge it. Some ministers visited the plantation speaking of obedience, submission, and divine order while ignoring the suffering before their eyes. Passages were quoted to portray bondage as God's will, a sacred duty rather than a moral crime. Meanwhile, the enslaved developed their own spiritual world, blending ancestral beliefs with quiet Christianity that emphasized liberation rather than compliance. Night gatherings in the woods carried whispered prayers for deliverance, not just in heaven, but on earth. These spiritual moments became acts of resistance, reminding them that their souls could not be owned. Yet discovery of such meetings risked severe punishment, forcing faith to live in secrecy and silence. Beneath all this structure lay an unspoken tension that pulsed through Blackwood like a hidden heartbeat. Every act of cruelty, every broken promise, and every stolen family moment piled higher the weight of resentment. Yet the system remained meticulously maintained, designed to prevent unity through division, favoritism, and constant surveillance. Still, solidarity grew quietly in glances, shared burdens, and mutual protection when possible. The plantation appeared stable on the surface, orderly and profitable, but beneath it ran a current of unrest that no amount of force could fully contain. The turning point did not arrive with thunder or rebellion, but with an ordinary afternoon that slowly bled into something unforgettable, the kind of day that begins quietly and ends carved into memory. The fields shimmered under a relentless sun, workers moving in mechanical rhythm while cicadas rattled in the trees like broken machinery. The young man was assigned near the riverbank that day, hauling bundles heavier than his frame, sweat soaking his shirt until it clung to his skin. He felt the familiar ache in his back and the dry burn in his throat, yet nothing seemed different from countless days before. Still, a strange tension hung in the air, subtle but unmistakable, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Somewhere beyond the mansion, a distant shout echoed, swallowed quickly by the open sky. He did not know then that this ordinary moment was about to fracture his world. A small group of workers labored together near a wagon that had sunk into soft mud, its wheels tilting awkwardly. The overseer circled them impatiently, snapping commands while chewing on a piece of tobacco, his eyes sharp and unforgiving. Among them was an older man who had mentored the young worker since his arrival at Blackwood, a figure of quiet strength who carried both scars and wisdom. As they strained to lift the wheel free, the older man stumbled, weakened by exhaustion and heat. The overseer reacted instantly, his temper flaring like dry tinder catching fire. What followed was not unusual for the plantation, yet the cruelty felt sharper that day, as if something inside the young man snapped with each lash of the whip. He stood frozen, muscles trembling, heart pounding in his ears louder than the blows. The older man did not cry out at first, clenching his jaw and refusing to give the overseer the satisfaction of hearing pain. His back arched with each strike, yet his eyes remained steady, locked on the young worker across the mud. In that gaze passed a silent message, part warning, part farewell, part defiance that transcended words. Blood began to seep through torn fabric, staining the earth beneath him, and the air filled with a sickening mixture of sweat, iron, and dust. Around them, others pretended to work, heads bowed, knowing that any interference would bring the same fate. The young man felt his chest tighten, breaths coming shallow as rage and helplessness collided inside him. For the first time, the plantation's cruelty felt deeply personal rather than distant. When the overseer finally stepped back, the older man collapsed beside the wagon, barely conscious yet still breathing. The young worker rushed forward before he could stop himself, kneeling in the mud despite the risk. His hands hovered uncertainly, afraid to touch but desperate to help, while murmured words spilled from his lips in a mixture of prayer and apology. The overseer sneered, warning him to return to work or face punishment as well, his voice dripping with contempt. Reluctantly, he obeyed, though every step away felt like a betrayal of the bond they shared. The image of his mentor lying broken beside the wagon burned itself into his mind, refusing to fade. In that moment, fear began to transform into something darker and more dangerous. That night in the quarters, the atmosphere felt heavier than usual, grief drifting between cabins like smoke. Whispers spread that the older man might not survive until morning, his wounds too severe for the meager care available. The young worker sat beside him in the dim glow of a lantern, listening to ragged breaths that sounded like the river choking on its own current. Around them, others gathered quietly, offering water, cloth, and silent solidarity. Stories of past injustices resurfaced, woven together into a tapestry of shared suffering that stretched across generations. The plantation no longer seemed merely cruel, but fundamentally corrupt, built on a foundation that demanded endless sacrifice. Something inside the young man shifted irrevocably. As dawn approached, the older man's breathing grew faint, his hand tightening weakly around the young worker's wrist. No words were spoken, yet the weight of the moment pressed down like an unbreakable chain. In that grasp lay both trust and a burden that could not be refused. The young man felt the enormity of what he was inheriting, not property or position, but responsibility for remembering and resisting. Outside, the horn sounded again, calling everyone back to the fields as if nothing had happened. Life on Blackwood would continue, indifferent to loss, unbothered by suffering. Yet for him, the world had tilted on its axis. He rose with the others, body moving automatically toward the fields, but his mind burned with thoughts he had never allowed himself before. The sun crested the horizon, bathing the plantation in golden light that felt obscene against the darkness he now carried. Every step across the hard-packed earth echoed with the memory of his mentor's fall, each breath filled with unspoken fury. The mansion loomed in the distance, pristine and untouched, its columns gleaming like monuments to cruelty. For the first time, he did not see power there, only a fragile illusion propped up by fear. As he took his place in the rows, hands gripping the tools that bound him, a quiet transformation took hold deep within his chest. After that day, silence became his sharpest weapon and patience his quiet companion, yet beneath that stillness a storm of intention slowly gathered. He learned to move through the plantation like a shadow that belonged everywhere and nowhere, listening more than speaking, observing more than reacting. Small moments that others overlooked became meaningful to him, the rhythm of patrols, the habits of overseers, the shifting moods of the master. In the fields he kept his head low, but his mind worked constantly, stitching fragments of information into a larger understanding of how Blackwood breathed. Trust was no longer given easily, yet he watched for those whose eyes carried the same restrained fire he felt inside. The older man's memory walked beside him in every step, reminding him that survival alone was no longer enough. Beneath his outward obedience, a quiet resolve took root. Resistance did not begin with grand gestures, but with whispers passed after dark when the quarters fell into uneasy rest. Songs carried coded meanings that spoke of rivers, roads, and distant horizons where chains did not exist. In these melodies he found both comfort and instruction, each verse layered with hidden truths shared across generations. Women braided messages into hair, men spoke through carved symbols in wood, and children repeated stories that sounded like fables but mapped real places beyond the plantation. He gathered these fragments carefully, treating them like sacred relics rather than idle tales. Every secret conversation deepened his connection to a community that refused to disappear. What looked like survival to outsiders was slowly becoming something more deliberate. He sought out those who had lived at Blackwood longest, elders whose backs bore the history of the land in scars and whose minds held maps no paper could capture. Sitting beside them in the dim glow of lanterns, he absorbed lessons about the river's currents, the hidden paths through the woods, and the seasons when travel was least dangerous. They spoke softly, never naming their intentions outright, knowing that words could betray them. In return, he offered respect, strength, and the promise that their knowledge would not be wasted. These exchanges built a network of quiet solidarity that spread from cabin to cabin. Resistance grew not as a single plan, but as a shared understanding that something must eventually change. Meanwhile, he sharpened his own skills in ways that drew no suspicion, mastering every task assigned to him with careful precision. He learned to read the land like a living text, noting where fences were weak, where night sounds masked movement, and where danger lurked unseen. The river became both teacher and ally, its shifting tides revealing possibilities and risks in equal measure. Even his labor in the fields turned into study, tracking patterns in harvest cycles and overseer rotations. To anyone watching, he appeared diligent and compliant, yet inside he was constantly preparing. Every day layered another piece onto an invisible foundation of readiness. Trust was the most fragile element of all, for betrayal could mean death, so relationships formed slowly and deliberately. He tested others through small acts of cooperation, offering help without asking for anything in return. Over time, he recognized those who shared his unspoken purpose through subtle signals. A glance held a second too long. A song hummed with particular emphasis. Together they began to coordinate in the smallest ways, covering for one another, sharing resources, and watching the plantation from multiple angles. Their unity was never loud, never visible, but steadily growing beneath the surface. In that silence lay both safety and strength. Risk was always present, hanging over every whispered word and coded gesture like a blade. Rumors of punishments traveled quickly through the quarters, reminding them how fragile their plans were. Yet fear did not stop them. It sharpened their caution and deepened their resolve. They learned to disguise intention within routine, blending preparation with everyday survival so seamlessly that even sharp eyes would see nothing amiss. Hope, carefully guarded, became a quiet current flowing between them. It did not promise freedom tomorrow, but it kept the idea alive. Through all of this, the young man changed in ways that could not be measured, his grief slowly transforming into purposeful determination. Blackwood remained the same from the outside, orderly, profitable, and terrifying, yet beneath that facade, something invisible was shifting. Every whispered conversation, every shared glance, every coded song added weight to a movement that had no official name. The plantation might still command bodies, but it could no longer completely own minds. The night settled over Blackwood like a heavy, breathing thing, thicker than any darkness he had known before. Crickets fell strangely silent, as if the land itself sensed what was approaching, while the river moved sluggishly beneath a sky bruised with clouds. Lanterns flickered along the overseer's path, their wavering light stretching long, distorted shadows across the ground. Inside the quarters, most pretended to sleep, bodies still but minds alert, listening for every distant footstep. The young man lay on his back, staring at the cracked wooden ceiling, feeling his heart hammer in a rhythm that matched the slow roll of thunder far away. For weeks he had watched, waited and calculated, yet in that moment waiting felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Sweat gathered along his temples, though the air was cool, and every breath tasted like iron. Beyond the gates, the mansion stood lit but restless, windows glowing like watchful eyes against the black horizon. Music drifted faintly from within, laughter carried on the night breeze from a gathering the master had insisted upon despite unease in the region. Carriages had come and gone earlier, their wheels grinding into the road while enslaved workers served food, poured drinks, and remained invisible. Now, as the hour grew late, guests retreated to their rooms or left for home, leaving the master alone with his confidence and his guards. The young man had mapped every light, every patrol, every door in his mind, until the layout of the estate felt carved into his bones. Still, seeing it before him in the dark made the task feel larger than any plan. Quiet movement rippled through the quarters as trusted figures slipped from cabins one by one, vanishing into the tree line without sound. No words were spoken, no signals given, only a shared understanding that could not be broken. The riverbank became their gathering place, its reeds whispering as bodies brushed past them. Moonlight caught on water, creating silver paths that seemed to stretch toward freedom and danger in equal measure. There, in the shadows, they confirmed what had been understood for weeks, that the moment could not be delayed any longer. The young man felt the weight of their trust press against his chest, heavier than chains, yet somehow steadier. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, the master moved through his hallways with a complacency that bordered on arrogance. He extinguished lamps one by one, confident that order reigned beyond his walls. Servants who remained nearby kept their eyes lowered, aware of the tension, but powerless to alter it. The grand rooms felt emptier than usual, echoes bouncing softly off polished floors and towering columns. Portraits of past masters stared down from the walls, frozen in expressions of entitlement that had passed from generation to generation. The young man watched from a distance, hidden behind thick shrubbery, studying every motion as if it were part of a final lesson. When the guards shifted positions, the path opened like a door that existed only for a heartbeat. Movement was swift, disciplined, and nearly soundless as shadows crossed ground that had never belonged to them. Branches bent without snapping, gravel crunched underfoot but blended into the night's murmur, and breath was held collectively like a prayer. They slipped past the outer fence where weakness in the structure had long been noted, moving closer to the heart of the estate. Fear threaded through the group, yet it was braided with resolve, each step carrying them beyond the point of return.